There are villages on this earth that feel like they should not exist. Too high above the drop, too deep inside the forest, too far out on open water. And yet people did not just pass through these places. They stayed for years, for generations. Some cling to mountain slopes. Some stand above rivers, lakes, or the sea. Others remain hidden behind jungle, stone, mist, and old ritual. No one lives in places like these by accident. Life here is never simple. A path can become a test. Water, shelter, distance, and weather all mean something different. Even ordinary things have to be earned. That is why these villages matter. They are not only remote, they are human answers to difficult land, difficult water, and difficult survival. They speak of endurance, of belonging, of memory, and of the quiet will to make a home where almost no home should be possible. In this film, we travel to some of the world's most unusual villages. Places above clouds, deep in rainforest, on storm-beaten islands, and beside sacred ground. Because the most extraordinary villages are not the ones that conquered the landscape. They are the ones that learned how to endure inside it. Wae Rebo, the village above the clouds. Some places do not look built so much as patiently won from the landscape. Wae Rebo is one of them. High in the mountains of Flores in eastern Indonesia, this village sits about 1,100 meters above sea level, reached only after a steep trek on foot through forest and mist. Indonesia's official tourism site describes it as isolated, surrounded by mountains and dense woodland, with limited electricity and no mobile signal. That matters because remoteness is not just part of its image, it is part of its truth. What makes Wae Rebo unforgettable is the shape of its homes. The village is known for its mbaru nyang, tall conical houses wrapped in thatch from roofline to ground, rising out of the valley like dark silhouettes against the cloud. UNESCO's 2012 Heritage Award profile describes Wae Rebo as architecturally remarkable for these towering structures, and notes that the village's original formation of 7 houses was reinstated through vernacular building methods and close cooperation between villagers and architects. But the beauty of Wae Rebo is not just visual. It is structural, social, and spiritual at the same time. In the village layout, the 7 houses stand in a circular formation around a central ceremonial space known as the kompang, creating a sense of order that reflects kinship, protection, and a shared worldview rather than mere convenience. Inside each house, life rises upward in layers. Daily living below, food and goods above, seeds for the future higher still. And at the top, a sacred space reserved for offerings and ancestors. In other words, the house is not simply shelter. It is almost a vertical map of life itself. Survival, continuity, and memory held under one roof. That is also why Wae Rebo feels deeper than a beautiful travel image. In 2012, the rebuilding of the village's traditional houses received UNESCO's Award of Excellence. The citation praised the project not only for preserving buildings, but for safeguarding both tangible and intangible heritage, construction knowledge, ritual meaning, and community pride in a rare and endangered environment. That is the part that lingers. Wae Rebo is not powerful because it looks cinematic, though it does. It is powerful because it proves that isolation does not always mean emptiness. Sometimes it means concentration on memory, on ritual, on mutual dependence, and on the few things a community decides must not be lost. Bajau, the village without solid ground. You understand this world only when you realize that nothing beneath it is fixed. No road, no stone foundation, No solid earth held quietly under the house. Only water, stilts, boats, tide, light, and the constant movement of the sea. Among the sea-oriented Sama Bajau communities of the Sulu archipelago, Sabah, and nearby island waters, villages like these were built over shallow coastal seas and estuaries, while some families traditionally lived directly on boats, anchoring together offshore. Britannica describes the Sama as one of the major ethno-linguistic peoples of insular Southeast Asia, with sea-based groups often identified as Bajau Laut. That is what makes this place feel so different from everything that came before. In most villages, the land comes first. Here, the water does. Wooden homes stand on piles above the shallows. Narrow walkways connect one house to the next. Small boats take the place of streets. Fishing is not something done outside the village. It is woven into the village itself. For many Sama Bajau communities, fishing and the gathering of marine resources have long been central to survival, trade, and daily life. But the deeper difference is not architectural. It is physical. For generations, Bajau divers have hunted underwater on a single breath, moving through reefs and coastal depths with a calm that can seem almost unreal to outsiders. A 2018 study in Cell found that the Bajau population studied had significantly larger spleens than a nearby land-based group, a trait the researchers linked to their long tradition of breath-hold diving. National Geographic's coverage of the study notes that Bajau divers have been documented staying underwater for several minutes at a time while foraging and fishing. That does not make them a myth. It makes them something more interesting. It shows how far a human life can adapt when the environment is not background, but destiny. Over time, the sea did not simply feed these communities. It helped shape their routines, their settlements, their economy, and even, according to current research, aspects of the body itself. That is why Bajau villages stay in the mind. They challenge one of our oldest assumptions, that a home must begin on firm ground. Here, home was often something lighter, more fragile, and yet more deeply learned. A woven world of water, memory, and endurance, held together above the tide. Sagada, where coffins remain on the cliffs. In Sagada, you look up differently, not toward a summit, not toward a church tower, but toward the limestone walls above the valley, where wooden coffins still hang from rock or rest inside burial caves. What makes the place so arresting is not only the image itself, but the fact that these are not symbols or legends. They are part of a real funerary landscape in Mountain Province, one that has drawn attention for generations because the dead remain visibly written into the mountain. That is what gives Sagada such a strong hold on the mind. Here, the most important structure is not the house on the slope, but the way a community places memory into stone. The ILO's case study on Sagada says the hanging coffins were reserved for especially distinguished or honorable figures in the community, particularly prominent men connected to the Dapai, the traditional council and civic center. In that sense, height was never just geography. It also carried status, judgment, and remembrance. The cliff did not simply receive the dead. It marked how the living understood a life well lived. Even the body followed a different logic of farewell. The same ILO source describes the traditional preparation known as sangadil, in which the dead were bound in a compact fetal position before burial. That detail matters because it shows that Sagada's burial customs were never random or theatrical. They belong to a larger way of seeing death, not as immediate disappearance, but as a passage still held inside ritual, kinship, and place. Some coffins were hung on cliffs, others were placed in caves and crevices. Either way, the mountain became part of the ceremony itself, and that is why Sagada feels less shocking than unforgettable. What stays with you is not horror. It is the image of wooden coffins suspended above the valley, quiet and exposed, as if the dead were never meant to be sealed away completely. The practice has declined over time, with many residents now preferring cemetery burial under Christian influence and modern change. But the old cliffside burials remain as one of the clearest signs that in Sagada, death was once placed close to height, ancestry, and the continuing gaze of the living. Batanes, houses built to outlast the storm. In Batanes, the wind feels older than the village. Before you notice a single doorway or roofline, you sense that these islands were never made for anything fragile. Far to the north of the Philippine mainland, Batanes sits exposed to open sea, hard weather, and repeated storms. The Philippine Tourism Board describes it through its rolling terrain, dramatic coastlines, and traditional Ivatan stone houses. But what gives the place its real weight is not scenery alone. It is the fact that people learn to build here by taking the climate seriously. That is why the houses matter so much. The traditional Ivatan house was not designed to look picturesque. It was designed to remain standing. Philippine government sources describe these homes as built from stone, lime, wood, and kogon thatch, with forms shaped by the harsh conditions of the islands. Older houses could have very thick walls, small openings, and low, heavy roofs meant to endure wind, rain, and repeated typhoons. In Batanes, architecture is not an aesthetic statement first. It is stored experience. It is weather turned into structure. That makes Batanes different from many of the other villages in this film. The drama here is not a cliff burial, a ritual mask, or a settlement hidden deep in the jungle. It is something more practical, and in some ways, more relatable. The quiet discipline of a community that built for survival. The houses do not seem to challenge the landscape. They seem to accept its terms. And because of that, they endure with a kind of earned dignity that modern viewers can immediately understand. That is also why Batanes stays with you. These homes are not memorable because they are unusual. They are memorable because they reveal a truth most people still recognize. When the world around you is unstable, shelter becomes more than shelter. It becomes judgment, restraint, memory, and care made visible. In Batanes, survival was never separate from architecture. The house itself became the first line of resilience. Aït Ben Haddou, the earthen fortress at the edge of the desert. Here, even the color feels ancient. Red earth, dry light, angular towers rising above a valley that looks half oasis, half warning. Aït Ben Haddou, in Morocco's Ouarzazate province, is not just a beautiful village in the desert. UNESCO describes it as a ksar, a group of earthen buildings enclosed by defensive walls reinforced with corner towers, and calls it one of the most striking examples of southern Moroccan architecture. It was added to the World Heritage List in 1987, not simply because it is picturesque, but because it preserves a traditional pre-Saharan way of building that has become increasingly vulnerable over time. That is what changes the air of the film. Until now, many of these villages have felt suspended above cliffs, hidden in jungle, or raised over water. Aït Ben Haddou brings us somewhere drier, harsher, and more exposed. The houses gather tightly inside the walls, as if protection had to be built into the settlement from the beginning. In a place like this, architecture was never just about shelter. It was about defense, heat, storage, closeness, and the hard logic of survival where the land opens toward the desert. Its historical role as a fortified settlement on older routes linking inland Morocco to Saharan space gives the site that deeper feeling of movement, caution, and endurance. The material itself tells the story. Earth, raw brick, timber, plaster. Everything here feels both strong and fragile at once. Conservation specialists note that the Ksar's power comes partly from the technical skill of earthen builders who adapted construction to a steep hillside. but also from the fact that such architecture must be maintained constantly to survive weather, abandonment, and change. That is why Aït Ben Haddou has dignity. It does not try to defeat the landscape by becoming stone. It remains earth, and because of that, it has to be cared for again and again. And that is why this place stays with you. Not as one building, not even as one village, but as a silhouette, an entire fortress of earth rising between valley and desert, as if the landscape briefly taught itself how to hold a human settlement. In other places, permanence is made of rock. Here, permanence had to be rebuilt from dust, memory, and watchfulness. Korowai, houses raised above the rainforest. Some villages are remembered because of what surrounds them. Korowai is remembered because of where the houses begin. Deep in southeastern Papua, Korowai communities became widely known for dwellings built high above the forest floor, sometimes in clearings cut into dense rainforest. Anthropologist Rupert Stash notes that images of Korowai and Kombai treehouses spread globally in the 1990s and quickly turned them into one of the most recognizable visual symbols of New Guinea in international media. And that is exactly why this place has to be told carefully. From a distance, the houses can look almost unreal. Long wooden platforms lifted on tall trunks and poles, rising out of heat, leaves, and wet air as if they had grown from the forest itself. But for the Korowai, these structures were never just spectacular objects. Stash's work shows that Korowai houses carry meanings tied to belonging, time, death, and social life. A house is not simply where a family sleeps. It marks attachment to land, kinship, and a lived place in the world. That matters because outsiders often reduced the Korowai to a simpler image. In magazines and television, they were frequently presented as the treehouse people, a label that made height the whole story and turned a complex society into a symbol of remoteness. Stash argues that global media often flattened Korowai life into a visual shorthand of wildness and distance, while Smithsonian reporting on the region also ties houses to clan land, ancestry, and social geography rather than mere novelty. What stays with you, then, is not just the height. It is the idea that in a world of swamp, insects, rain, distance, and dense vegetation, home could take this form at all. Not a fortress of stone, not a village square, but a raised shelter of wood, balance, and memory built just far enough above the ground to turn exposure into protection. That is what makes Korowai so memorable. The rainforest is not the backdrop here. It is the condition that shaped the house, and the house, in turn, shaped the life lived inside it. This also fits the deeper logic of your source text. The Korowai segment is strongest when the treehouse remains the hook, but the real emotional center is that the house means identity, refuge, and belonging, not spectacle alone. Buscalan, where memory is tapped into skin. The first thing that stays with you in Buscalan is not the mountain, it is the sound, a dry, steady tapping. Thorn against stick, soot pressed into skin. A rhythm so small you could almost miss it, and yet strong enough to carry the memory of an entire people. High in the mountains of Kalinga in northern Luzon, Buscalan is still remote enough that the journey feels like part of the meaning. Vogue Philippines describes the village as a hard place to reach even now, after road improvements, and notes that for years its distance helped preserve a way of life that did not fully open itself to the outside world. It is here that Apo Wang Od, the best-known Mamba Batok of her generation, continued the old hand-tapped method of tattooing with a thorn and soot, long after many thought the practice would disappear. That is why Buscalan feels different from the other villages in this film. Its most powerful structure is not a house, a cliff, or a wall. It is the body itself. In older Kalinga tradition, tattoos were never just decoration. Vogue Philippines notes that men earned them through bravery and headhunting status, while women received them in connection with beauty, fertility, and social value. Older scholarship on Kalinga tattooing likewise describes the practice as historically rich, socially meaningful, and deeply tied to identity rather than fashion alone. A mark on the skin could carry rank, memory, passage, and belonging all at once. But Buscalan is not only a story of preservation, it is also a story of change. Recent research on Buscalan argues that the meaning of traditional Kalinga tattoos has shifted as tourism expanded and the village became widely known beyond the Cordilleras. Vogue Philippines reports that tattooing, once closely tied to older village life, now supports new livelihoods in Buscalan, including younger tattoo practitioners and guides. The tradition did not vanish. It changed its setting, its audience, and in some cases, its meaning. And that is what makes Buscalan so alive. This is not a village where culture sits behind glass. It moves through hands. It passes from an elder to her kin. It leaves the mountain one body at a time. Wangod's grandnieces, including Grace Palikas and Elyang Wigan, have become part of that continuation. And Vogue Philippines frames that next generation as proof that Batok did not end with one legendary artist. What remains in Buscalan is not just the image of an old tattoo tradition surviving in isolation. It is something more human than that. A village where memory is still being made visible, tap by tap, on living skin. Tana Toraja, where the dead remain. Above the valley. In Tana Toraja, death does not leave the landscape quickly. It stays. In the house, in the ceremony, in the cliff face above the fields. High in the green uplands of South Sulawesi, Torajan life has long treated death not as a single moment, but as a passage that takes time, family, ritual, and public remembrance. That is part of why this place feels so different from almost everything around it. Indonesia's official tourism materials describe Tana Toraja through its mountain setting, its Tongkonan ancestral houses, and its funeral traditions, especially the Rambu Solo ceremony and the cliff tombs of places like Londa and Ketekesu. The houses tell you that first. A Tongkonan is not just a home with a dramatic roofline. It is a family center, a ceremonial space, and a marker of lineage. Indonesia's official heritage page describes the Tongkonan as the social and customary heart of Torajan life, used for family gatherings and major rituals, including funerals. That matters because in Toraja, a house is never only about shelter. It is also about continuity, who belongs, who came before, and who will still be remembered after death. And then comes the part outsiders rarely forget. Rambu Solo, the great funeral ceremony, may take place long after a person has died. Official Indonesian tourism sources note that families can spend months or even years preparing for it, because the ritual is not treated as a small, private farewell. It is one of the most important communal obligations in Torajan society. Some scholarly work likewise notes that the deceased may remain in the home before the final ceremony, reflecting a view of death as a gradual transition rather than an immediate disappearance. That is why Tana Toraja does not feel merely dramatic. It feels deliberate. The dead are not pushed out of sight as fast as possible. They remain present until the community is ready to carry them onward in the proper way. And when that movement finally happens, memory rises into the rock itself. In sites like Londa, tombs are cut into the cliffs and Tau effigies, carved figures representing the deceased, look out over the valley from balconies in the stone. Official tourism sources for South Sulawesi identify these cliff graves, Tongkonan villages, and Rambu Solo as some of the defining cultural features of the region. What stays with you in Toraja is not horror. It is the calm refusal to pretend that death is separate from life. The house, the ceremony, the mountain, the ancestors, all of it remains connected. That is what gives Tana Toraja its unusual force. Not the spectacle of burial alone, but the idea that departure is something a whole community must carry, and that remembrance belongs not underground and forgotten, but high above the valley, where it can still be seen. This reading also follows the emotional center of your source text, where Toraja is defined less by shock than by the visible bond between death, family, and enduring place. Asaro, the faces that turned fear into memory. First, you see the faces, white clay, hollow eyes, a mouth frozen somewhere between a grin and a threat. Then the bodies appear behind them, moving slowly out of the highland mist. And for a moment it feels less like a village performance than an apparition. In Papua New Guinea's eastern highlands, near Goroka, the Asaro mudmen have become one of the most recognizable cultural images in the country. Official Papua New Guinea tourism sources describe Goroka and the surrounding eastern highlands as the home of the famous Asaro mudmen, whose masked dances are still performed in nearby villages and at major events such as the Goroka Show. What makes Asaro so powerful is that the place is remembered less for a building than for a transformation. The story most often told says that after conflict, men from the Asaro area hid in a river and emerged coated in pale mud at dusk, frightening their enemies who mistook them for spirits. But scholars who studied the tradition more closely argue that the public form of the mudmen performance is more complicated than a single ancient legend. Research by Tun Otto and Robert Verloop traces the now famous mudmen tradition as something that developed through ongoing interaction between local storytelling, public performance, and tourist expectations, rather than as a simple untouched survival from the distant past. That complexity is part of what makes the image stronger, not weaker. The masks themselves remain unforgettable. Clay forms, often decorated and shaped for maximum unease, paired with slow movement, silence, and exaggerated presence. Papua New Guinea tourism materials present the mudmen as one of the defining cultural experiences of the Eastern Highlands, while coverage of the Goroka Show describes them as a major attraction within a broader world of tribal performance, chant, costume, and display. In other words, Asaro is not only a story about fear, it is also a story about how a community learned to turn fear into image, and image into identity. That is why Asaro belongs here, after the audience is already inside the journey. What stays with you is not a monument or a skyline. It is a face made of mud. A village can sometimes become unforgettable, not through walls, towers, or cliffs, but through the single image it leaves behind. In Asaro, culture lives in performance, in costume, in the body itself, and in the uneasy power of being seen before being understood. That also matches the emotional center of your source text, where Asaro is defined not by architecture first, but by the mask as the village's lasting sign. Tagbanua, between limestone, water, and ancestral memory. With the Tagbanua of Coron, nothing begins cleanly. The land does not end in a straight line. The sea does not begin in one either. Limestone walls rise out of blue water, hidden lakes sit behind stone, and the whole landscape feels less like territory than like something half-remembered. Coron Island is known for its steep karst cliffs, brackish and inland lakes, caves, reefs, and coastal waters. And UNESCO's tentative list description explicitly notes both the island's dramatic rock formations and its clean and sacred lakes. That is why this place feels softer than Asaro, but no less mysterious. For the Tagbanua, this was never just a village on land. It was a lived space of coast, reef, boat, cliff, and ancestral waters. UNESCO's Coron Island profile notes that the Tagbanua claim recognized ancestral fishing grounds as part of their domain, while scholarship in marine policy describes the Coron Tagbanua case as a landmark struggle over indigenous rights to both land and sea. In other words, the water here was not background. It was part of belonging itself. The stone matters too. In a place like Coron, limestone is not merely scenery. The cliffs, caves, lakes, and nesting sites carry use, taboo, livelihood, and reverence at the same time. UNESCO's description ties Tagbanua culture closely to caves, swallows' nests, sacred lakes, and rock formations, which is why the island feels so unusual. The landscape is not simply occupied, it is read. It holds memory as much as shelter. So what stays with you is not one structure. It is the feeling of a homeland made of thresholds, rock and saltwater, silence and movement, use and restraint. That matches the emotional center of your original segment, where Tagbanua is strongest not as a spectacle, but as a place where limestone, coral, ancestry, and everyday life blur into one quiet, hard-to-define world. Mentawai, where the forest still sets the terms. Before you recognize a village here, you hear the rainforest first, water falling from leaves, wood shifting under bare feet, a paddle striking a dugout canoe somewhere beyond the trees. On Siberut, the largest island in the Mentawai chain west of Sumatra, life has long been shaped by rainforest, rivers, and isolation. UNESCO describes Siberut as both ecologically distinct and culturally significant, with indigenous Mentawai communities living inside a biosphere reserve where nature and human life remain closely tied. That matters because Mentawai is not powerful for one dramatic image. It is powerful because the forest is not background here. It still sets the rhythm of daily life. That is why the houses feel less imposed on the land than drawn out of it. Traditional Mentawai communities were organized around uma, clan-based longhouses that served as social centers as well as dwellings. Scholarly work on Mentawai society describes these uma as tied to kinship structure, while your source text also captures the practical side clearly. Wooden buildings raised over damp ground, open enough for airflow and movement, and built for a world of mud, humidity, river access, and shared life. Here, architecture is not trying to dominate the rainforest. It is trying to stay livable inside it. But the real depth of Mentawai goes beyond the house. What gives this place its weight is the old understanding that the forest is not merely a resource, it is a living field of relationship. Recent scholarship and ethnographic work on Mentawai belief describe Arat Sabulungan as an indigenous religious system still associated with the interior of Siberut, one in which ritual life, healing knowledge, plants, animals, and unseen presence remain interconnected. In practical terms, that means hunting, gathering, medicine, and everyday caution are never entirely separate from belief. The forest feeds, shelters, and teaches, but it also demands respect. And that is what makes Mentawai different from the other villages in this film. There is no cliffside shock here, no single ritual image that overwhelms everything else. What stays with you instead is something slower and deeper. The sense of a human life still shaped almost hour by water, vegetation, soil, distance, and memory. In Mentawai, endurance does not look like conquest. It looks like adjustment. a community learning over generations how to live not against the rainforest, but inside its terms. That emotional center also follows your original segment closely. Asmat, the labyrinth of water and wood. In Asmat, a village does not seem to begin on land at all. It begins on a plank, a narrow walkway, a strip of wood above mud, tide, and brown water. Your original text gets that feeling exactly right. This is a world where water and ground never fully separate, and where even the idea of a street has to be reimagined. That is not just atmosphere, it is geography. The Asmat live in southwestern New Guinea along a vast river system that drains toward the Arafura Sea, and the settlement logic of the region was shaped by swamp, mangrove, and tidal water rather than by roads. An academic study of Agats, the main town in the Asmat area, describes the region as a maze of rivers running through lowland swamp forest, notes that travel between villages historically depended on waterways, and states plainly that there is no land access connecting one district to another. That is why the built world feels lifted rather than planted. The same study explains that houses in the Asmat coastal area were generally built on pilings 2 meters or more above the ground because of surging tides in the brackish rivers. Boardwalks, narrow cross lanes, river edges, boats, and raised structures were not secondary details. They were the basic grammar of daily life. So when we speak of Asmat as a labyrinth of water and wood, that is not poetic exaggeration. It is very close to how settlement had to function there. But Asmat is more than a watery landscape. It is also one of the great wood cultures of the world. The Metropolitan Museum of Art notes that wood carving has long been central to Asmat life, and that Asmat belief recognizes a close relationship between humans and trees, even describing wood as a source of life. The same source explains the importance of the Ju, the men's ceremonial house, where community matters are discussed, artworks are made, and ceremonies are held. In other words, wood is not only what the village is built from, it is also what memory, ritual, and authority pass through. That is what gives Asmat its atmosphere. Not the open-sea lightness of the Bajau, not the mountain remoteness of Buscalan, not the cliffside drama of Sagada. Asmat feels heavier than that, wetter, closer to the tide. A place where a village does not conquer the landscape so much as lift itself just enough to survive inside it. And that is why it stays in the mind. Because here, home is not anchored in stone or dry ground, but suspended in a shifting world of river water, carved wood, and ancestral presence. That emotional center is already present in your source text, where Asmat is defined by exactly this in-between world of mud, timber, waterways, and memory. Acoma Pueblo, the city that chose the edge. Here the village does not hide inside the landscape. It stands right on its rim. Acoma Pueblo, often called Sky City, rises on a high sandstone mesa in western New Mexico. For many American viewers, this place feels familiar in a way few others in this film will. Not because it is ordinary, but because it belongs to a much older layer of American history than most people were ever taught to see. The National Park Service describes Acoma as one of the oldest continuously inhabited communities in what is now the United States, with surviving remains dating to around 1100 CE. While Acoma tradition reaches much deeper than any modern timeline can fully hold. What makes Acoma so striking is not only its age, it is the logic of where it stands. Adobe and stone homes sit above the desert like a deliberate answer to exposure, distance, and danger. Before the modern road, access to the mesa was difficult.
and official New Mexico sources note that people once reached it mainly by hand-cut steps carved into the sandstone itself. A settlement on a height like this was never just a place to live. It was protection, visibility, and cohesion built into stone.
But Acoma is not just dramatic because of where it sits. It carries the weight of survival. The site also holds San Esteban del Rey Mission Church, built by Franciscan missionaries in the early to mid-1600s. The same official sources place Acoma within the long history of Spanish intrusion into the southwest, including destruction in the late 16th century and rebuilding that followed. That matters for the tone of this place. Acoma is not simply old, it is enduring. Its history is not a quiet timeline, it is a record of permanence under pressure. And that is what makes Acoma such a powerful place to begin. Because, for an American audience, this is more than a remote village on a rock. It is a reminder that American history did not begin with highways, state lines, or the frontier myth. It began much earlier, in places like this, where a community learned to turn height into defense, earth into shelter, and endurance into identity. In many villages, the house protects the people. In Acoma, the rock protects life first, and everything else rises from that decision. Trunyan, where death is left in the open. By the time you reach Trunyan, the air feels different. The village sits on the edge of Lake Batur, inside the old volcanic basin of central Bali, in a landscape of dark slopes, still water, and quiet enclosure. Bali's provincial tourism office describes Trunyan as a Bali Aga village whose burial ground lies apart from the main settlement on the lakeshore, reached by boat across the Caldera Lake. That isolation matters because the place already feels removed before you even learn what happens there. Trunyan is remembered not for its houses, but for the way it keeps the dead in view. Here, the best-known mortuary tradition is not cremation and not burial in the usual sense. Bodies are placed above ground in open bamboo structures beneath the sacred tarumenyan tree, a custom often referred to as mepasa in recent scholarship. Local tradition holds that the tree's fragrance helps neutralize the smell of decomposition, and both Bali's tourism authority and recent academic work describe that belief as central to the identity of the place. What makes Trunyan linger in the mind is not shock alone. It is the calmness of the setting. The lake remains still. The mountain walls hold everything in: the tree, the bodies, the bamboo, the volcanic ground. Nothing is hidden, and yet nothing is performed for drama. Recent research describes this funerary landscape as part of a wider cosmological order rather than a sensational exception. While studies of Trunyan's beliefs and origin traditions tie the village's identity closely to the tarumenyan tree itself. Death here is not pushed out of sight. It stays inside the landscape, and the landscape accepts it. That is what gives Trunyan its unusual weight. It does not feel loud, it feels final. Not because the village is trying to disturb anyone, but because it never agreed to the modern idea that death must always be sealed away. Near the end of a journey like this, Trunyan leaves the deepest kind of impression. Not a spectacle, but a quiet confrontation with a world in which the dead remain present, the living do not look away, and nature itself seems to stand inside the ritual. That emotional direction also follows your source text closely.